What, they think we got 3 Rod Brindamores or what?
I think I started lifting real light weights when I was like 12.
You are now listening to the Rod the Podcast with your hosts, Jordan Betts and Mike Menn.
All right, Michael, we're going to be a little off the cuff tonight. It's Wednesday, March 1st, day and a half before the NHL trade deadline this upcoming Friday. Man, it's been an absolute whirlwind. Literally moments ago, Jacob Chychrun was traded to the Ottawa Senators. Canes have made some, what I would describe more bottom lineup tertiary moves today. Man, it's the Metro, the East especially, is just completely loading up. We got a full episode, lots to talk about, a lot of movement. We'll talk Canes moves. We'll talk Canes lineup as it currently stands. Go through any potential cap space and moves that are now available with that cap space. And just, hey, where the Canes rank right now in the Eastern hierarchy and what can we expect moving forward? Turn it over to you and just ask, how are you doing right now?
I'm pretty good. It's been probably the most eventful lead up to a trade deadline in a long time. We've seen more trades in the 2 weeks leading up to the trade deadline than we have in a long, long time. It's been super entertaining for us. It's also allowed you to look at some of the different values for players, and it's been kind of surprising. I mean, you talked about the Chychrun deal earlier. The only difference between the Chychrun deal and the Hronek deal is a second-round pick. So Detroit trades Hronek to Vancouver for a first and a second from Vancouver, a bad team. Meanwhile, Arizona, who's been holding out on and had to have received a better offer down the road, gets a first, a second, and a second for a guy that's definitely has a higher ceiling than Hronek. It's just, it makes you laugh sometimes.
And that doesn't even get into Tampa Bay trading the absolute farm to Nashville for Tanner Jeannot. I mean, it's just people around the league laughing at that one. Lots happened. And so, unfortunately, not as much has happened here maybe in Canes land as people had hoped or expected. Contrary to prior seasons when Carolina was playoff bound and, ultimately they did win the division. Looks like they very, very well may do that again this year. Don didn't sit on his hands. I mean, there were moves. A move that seems like it's been years in the making. Jesse Puljujarvi. I know that's not the correct pronunciation, but that's like the Americanized version. So just give me the benefit of the doubt there. We're good with that. Canes traded for Puljujarvi, sent a former third-round pick in Pistula to Edmonton, which really just kind of seems like a, hey, restart for Puljujarvi. Edmonton, it just wasn't going to happen there. Any thoughts on that trade specifically?
Realistically, it's a win-win for both teams. Edmonton had kind of been out on Puljujarvi.
Oh, is that an extra little syllable there? It is Finnish.
Yes, Puljujarvi. Anyways, they'd been out on him.
Show off.
It hadn't gone. I practiced. It hadn't been going well for him in Edmonton. The writing was on the wall. It's been a player that the Canes have been trying to acquire, like you alluded to, for a while now. Don played the waiting game originally.
And I'm sure the price has only gone down.
The original ask, I think, was a first-round pick or something along those lines. And to end up only giving away Patrick Pistola, who is a borderline NHL caliber prospect, the likelihood of getting to the NHL isn't very high, but if he does, he's looking to be a bottom six player. You can live with giving that away all day. That's money in the bank. Puljujarvi, which is hard to say and annoying, but we'll do it out of respect. he's a guy that fits the Rod Brindamore style, right? Good skater, big frame, forechecks hard, doesn't have the finishing touch, aka the perfect Canes player.
Ironic that all the finished players are kind of the same.
Yeah.
Pass first playmakers that are not finishers.
They're taught to be all around players.
Now, he did
in
make magic at
Finland.
that World Juniors with Patrick Laine and Sebastian Aho. Maybe I don't anticipate him playing up in the lineup with Aho at any point soon, at least as he gets acclimated. And he's likely destined to be a fourth liner here. But if given the opportunity, I'd like to see if they can rekindle that. To me, and this is applies to the second trade the Canes have made. I think the bigger thing is no salary retained, and of course Edmonton was not going to do that. They're a contender. I thought there was an opportunity to maybe do that with the other trade in Shane Gostisbehere heading to Raleigh for a 2026 third rounder. So basically free, but no salary retained on that deal either, which leaves Carolina right now with 2.6, just over 2.6 million in cap space to play with. They could also move out Dylan Coughlin and create an additional 700 plus K, which would get them a little over 3.3 million. There's always the opportunity that someone could also be a third party broker. So I don't think we're necessarily done in the, 40-ish hours before the deadline. Please no one fact check that math.
Yeah, I got no help for you. It's close though.
Any thoughts on the Gostisbehere trade? Offense first defenseman has struggled and been a bit of a defensive liability throughout his career, but maybe can be a power play specialist to the point where, maybe Brady Shea and Brett Pesce aren't guys you want leading the man advantage.
Yeah, I mean, this will certainly take Pesce and Shea out of the mix ultimately on the power play. Love those guys, great defenders, not elite power play quarterbacks. It just is what it is. Gostisbehere is a guy that's good at moving the puck on the power play. He's got a wicked shot, especially for a defenseman. You're going to be able to rotate two guys at power play quarterback in Burns and in Gostisbehere that both have big shots. You can start to establish an identity of whether it's shooting from the point and getting tips or whether it's utilizing that shot to open up passing lanes. Whatever it may be, it's going to create a more uniform power play across the board. Definitely an upgrade. I think two of the guys, right, to jump back to the previous trade, we're going to call him JP to save us some time.
I appreciate that.
It's a guy that's going to essentially try out to be Jesper Foss's replacement next year. It's very likely that Jesper is going to hit the market because there is going to definitely be interest in him around the league, and it'll probably price him out of a third line role with the Hurricanes. You're getting your guy in early. He can help you currently in a fourth line role. And then you bring in a guy that's playing for his next contract in Gostisbehere, who's on his last year. He's somebody that's been successful as an offensive defenseman. If you can protect him defensively with Chatfield staying home, with more offensive starts as opposed to defensive zone starts, I think they're both trades that definitely help the team now, don't leverage the future, and still leave you with enough cap space to go make a dangerous ad if they decide the price is right.
And we're going to get to this in the end when we kind of talk where the Canes stack within the Eastern hierarchy. But, these are low cost, high upside moves. Truth be told, I don't see either making a super valuable impact, but at cost, kind of no brainers, right? Talented guys that, could exceed definitely my expectations and be impactful. I think when you look, especially at JP, the physicality kind of stands out to me. Even if he's not a huge banger, he does have there's the frame, right? The Canes are kind of considered a small finesse team. So just to throw out guys with the, at least presence to be physical, I think is really important. Kind of moving forward, unless you have any thoughts on those trades specifically. Mike, tell me where you kind of envision these guys slotting in, both kind of from day one and maybe where their roles shift as they become more comfortable here in Raleigh.
Well, I think that with Gostisbehere, he's going to be the guy that is going to compete with DeHaan. You don't acquire an offensive defenseman like that without the intention of bringing him in to help revitalize your power play, which is in the 20th area of
especially
the league
at $4
rankings.
million plus per.
Yeah, so you're not bringing him in to sit on the bench and watch. He's not a guy you bring in when somebody gets injured because he's a defenseman that can cover. Dahan is a guy where if you have an injury, he's going to be able to be a serviceable defenseman. He's not going to give you much else outside of that, but that's totally fine. Gostisbehere is a guy you're bringing in to be a difference maker, even if it is only marginal, and even if it is only on the power play. That is a little piece that could take you over the edge in terms of winning a series.
I think that's a great point, because when we talk about playoff hockey, we can talk about how the Canes have played, and we've had critiques with that just from how they're built, and that's translating from the regular season into the postseason. I made the comment to you the other day when I was venting that, hey, all these teams are loading up, Carolina's done nothing. But, upon reflection there, I mean, I think I called them the early 2000 Oakland A's. I think a more apt comparison is probably the Tampa Bay Rays, who for baseball fans out there, in the AL East, which is the most high budget division, the whole league in a non-cap sport, the Rays, the first or second smallest market team in the entire league budget-wise, competes, makes the playoffs, went to the World Series a few years ago. Carolina's more that. I mean, forward-thinking and kind of innovative. So it's not all doom and gloom here, right? I mean, it's still 32 Thoughts, Friedman and Merrick the other day talked about how this company become a pinnacle organization within the entire league. That has been built primarily on regular season performance. Now, we shouldn't discard that and act like it doesn't matter. Winning division titles is important. Getting to the dance is extremely valuable. I think where I've kind of gotten to, and not so much from like a doom and gloom standpoint, are these the types of moves that set it over the edge? And to go back to your point and talking about Gostisbehere, we understand in these playoff series that, hey, looking back to last year's, regardless of how Game 7 played out, that's a 7-game series that ultimately gets you eliminated. Could things have happened in the first 6 games by having a more potent power play, which he could potentially bring in or add to change the series? And so maybe these seem like kind of nominal moves, but when we're talking about a team that's performing at such a high level already, second best record in the league, leading the Metro, all those things, I think it can happen in the margins and on the periphery, where him improving your power play from, let's just make the math easy and say 20% to 25%. Well, that's 1 or 2 more goals a series that can put the Canes forward instead of being sent home.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that another thing that we have to take into account from especially like last year to this year, just to kind of touch on the playoffs and everything along those lines, is that when you look at the lineup, I think a big part of the Canes strategy too is getting them there, getting them accustomed to the playoffs and building that playoff performance. We won't know who takes the next step in the playoffs until the playoffs, right? So you look at a lineup, and number one, I think the team has become harder to play against this year. I think the addition of Brent Burns is an upgrade to a D'Angelo. I think that his presence in the playoffs will be larger than what Dougie's were previously. So I think defensively you've become a harder team. Chatfield has really impressed me this year and is a guy that seems to have that playoff edge, who's a guy that brings it every night. So you look at the defense, and then you're going down the middle. Aho, KK has really started to come on as of late. His defensive side of the game has been phenomenal. His offensive game is starting to click. And then you follow that with Stahl and Stasny, and then you have Stepan maybe as that next guy in. The depth and the difficulty to play against this team is harder than last year. You have Natchez, who's shooting from Ovi's office now all of a sudden. Svetch can get hot whenever. Jarvis has a year under his belt.
And he's gotten hot recently, yeah.
And seems to be coming out of the sophomore slump. All these little things can fall into place at the right time, which is the end of the season, not right now. So do I think there should be another addition for a goal scorer? Absolutely, no doubt about it. But then you're looking at a lineup that's really, you could add some guys we'll talk about later and turn your lineup into a lineup that's better than a lineup that adds Tarasenko and Kane just because they're flashy names.
And you know, we've talked about this window being kind of through the 22 or 23-24 season when a number of contracts toll and guys are free agents. But people are going, you got to make impact ads. And, you know, I've been that person on here too. But the point you're making is you can only prove yourself in the playoffs. Canes still have one of the younger cores in the league. Sometimes it just takes growth. Like, we haven't seen Svech be great in the playoffs.
No.
Well, I mean, at 22 years old, it could click, right? And sports history is littered with performers that couldn't get it done in the big moment, couldn't win a title, Peyton Manning, until you win a title, right?
Yeah.
Like, until it happens. And unfortunately, we talk small sample size in the playoffs because that's what they are. And so to be hot or cold over a 5 to 20 plus game span is not that crazy. We almost saw the Hurricanes lose a Stanley Cup in 2006 because the one guy just caught fire and was never heard of again. I'm blanking on his name, starts with a P. But to me, I think above the shiny new toy, how the kind of Rangers have gone about this deadline to where their own benefit. And I would be thrilled if I was a Rangers fan right now. I think they're exceptionally potent and could very easily come out of the East. But to me, it's going to be another test of can 1 through 12, which I think Carolina probably is the deepest in the entire league. And you can argue 1 through 13 or even 14. Can 1 through 14 overwhelm teams with the bottom of the lineup? The top 6 hold serve, and you just kind of overwhelm people. It's 4 lines rolling, heavy forecheck, speed, and that can win you a series too. So to me, it's who can kind of influence the opponent with their game style. And then on the back end, you touched on Burns, and Gostisbehere is not this guy, he's 5'11", but touched on Burns. I think the presence, 1 through 18 on your skaters is just a little bit more big and physical. And I think that's a good thing, even if we're not talking super much like guys that are bangers. I like where this team is positioned. I think we haven't even touched on it yet. Maybe the biggest question mark is goalie performance and health, Sure. And to me, if you get adequate goaltending, what we got from Antti Raanta last postseason, I think this team can still make an Eastern Conference final.
Yeah, I would agree. I think if any of your goalies get hot, I'm not as concerned about injury because I really do think that Anderson, Raanta, and Kochetkov could all come in. I mean, we saw the stretch of games Kochetkov had earlier in the season where he was our best goalie. So you look at what you have there, and the likelihood of one of them getting hot is pretty high in my opinion. So I'm less concerned about that than I was in the past. And to kind of go back to your point where talking about like the additions of Tarasenko and Kane for New York Rangers, I kind of look at it like if you relate hockey to finance, right? And you talk about the principle of keeping up with the Joneses, you can be the franchise that spends and spends and spends, and you might be like on the Joneses caliber for like a little while of time, but eventually those are the people that fall into poverty because they've overextended their means. And there is the savvy investor who might be kind of sneaking under the radar for a while, but eventually either passes them or stays at their level, if we're talking about a super competitive team, for an extended period of time for the rest of their future. And when I look at it, I look at a team like Toronto that is basically reassembled a lineup outside of their big names. And you're talking about trying to find chemistry and trying to find this and that. And you're talking about a GM that's looking for a new contract. And you look at all of that, and it creates this weird feeling. And you look at New York, and they get Patrick Kane for basically nothing, and they add Tarasenko, but there's always a negative side. And to me, the teams that like scare me a little bit more in that frame of mind is like a New Jersey, who went out, added a Timo Meier. I was very underwhelmed by the return they got for Meier. I don't think
we might have to have the conversation. Is Mike Greer good at this?
Yeah, I mean, that was, to me, I was personally pretty shocked by the return. They are making a huge bet that Shakir Mukhamadullin, or however you pronounce his name, is going to become a legit top 4 defenseman. And right now, that doesn't look like the reality. So you're kind of banking on that. And it kind of surprised me because I would have believed that the Canes had offered Morrow a first and a second. And instead, they went with a lot of nothing and some picks.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk a little further about the deadline. By the way, I love the little allusion to like Berkshire Hathaway versus Arc Innovation. Sure. Kathy Wood versus Warren Buffett on stylistically what you want to be, and how Warren Buffett continues just to outperform. Doesn't do the trends.
Like 93 or whatever,
incredible.
92, whatever.
But that's kind of. It relates to how Carolina has almost done things from a slow and steady wins the race. But yeah, I mean, in that example, with where I thought the Timo Meier what I thought it was going to be, I thought New Jersey was going to be that team. It's like, hey, you're having an unexpected year, probably a year ahead of time. I thought they were going to mortgage the future, and to me, that's just not a bet you should make this early in the cycle. Based on what they gave up, I think it was a terrific move for them. Now, Greer probably should have bled a lot more. They didn't. I think a really peculiar thing about this deadline, though, is the names. So now that Chikrin's been traded and Meier, the big names really haven't landed the huge deals we thought, but then we've had some secondary and tertiary guys get incredible, bring back incredible returns. I think the only name brand guy that's gotten a return that exceeded my expectation was O'Reilly. Everyone else has kind of been either status quo or lesser.
Yeah, it's been really odd to see some of the returns. I was expecting the Meier deal to include Holtz and one of their big 3 defensemen. Yeah, I thought there was going to be a lot more there. And at the end of the day, they chose the offer they thought was the best, and I think that they likely made a mistake. And only time will tell. We're sitting here playing the back chair GM.
We also don't know the organizational dynamics. It's rumored that when he interviewed for that job, that ownership did not want a prolonged rebuild. Well, it seems like he's trying to do it kind of half measured by bringing in a prospect that might be close, still getting first. It just doesn't really add up to me as a cohesive strategy. But before we kind of jump into, because I think we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, where do you have? Let's get back to where we slot the Canes lineup. I think this will be immensely brief, and then we'll talk about some players. Then we'll finish up with the trade deadline and Eastern Conference hierarchy stuff. JP, you see him slotting on the fourth line to start. Do you think there's any sort of Blendomatic type deal from Roddy?
No, I think he definitely starts on the fourth line. Rod is not a fan of messing up chemistry. The top 2 lines are going right now. Marty Stahl-Foss has been going forever. I think you'll see him slide in and really learn the system. I think down the road, if things stagnate and he's comfortable in the system, maybe. But you have to think back to guys like most recently, like KK. When KK came in, it took him a while to learn the system. I think we have to expect the same for JP. We'll see where things go, but I definitely see him as a fourth line.
We've heard Rod talk about how it is difficult to transition into an organization, into a lineup. That's important to be cognizant of as fans, and these are human beings. It's a hard thing to do. It's like expecting you to come in day one of a new job and perform at 100. It's impossible. You're still learning the ropes and getting comfortable with your surroundings. Before we go into kind of the next segment, I do want to give you kudos for pointing out how well KK has played. I think that's gone under the radar a little bit after the slow start, and maybe that is why we've seen Don not chase the shiny, expensive center or another scorers, because the chemistry right now, to your point, is really flowing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we had talked about adding a second line center, and it's not to say that can't still happen, but I think the way the team's running right now, I think the cheaper option, number one, centers are always going to be more expensive. getting a good scoring winger is just, I think that's just the cherry on top, honestly, at this point. So yeah, I mean, you don't want to mess with chemistry. You don't want to really shake things up to the extent where you're finding a new identity. It's not hard when you're in New York and you're adding a Patrick Kane who's already played with a Panarin, who's already won a Stanley Cup. But when you're bringing in guys
on
totally,
the margins, yeah.
it definitely becomes a little bit tougher.
So I think this will be a pretty fun segment. We get to once again, try and act like we're Don or something, and kind of prognosticate on what potential moves the Canes could make here the next few hours before the deadline. We'll do this before we maybe get to a more sour note on how we feel the team has been, because this has been more positive than I expected it to be when we got on here, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think sometimes you anticipate what you're going to say, but then when you get behind the mics and the points start going back and forth, you kind of, it's weird even for us to conceptualize in the moment. And so I'm feeling better about this. I hope you guys are. So Mike, you just alluded to it. Who would be your number one ad with the remaining 2.6 million up to 3.3? And remember, that means the Canes can add, multiply those numbers by 2. They can add players below that benchmark, assuming the trade or a third-party broker team facilitates some salary retainment up to 50%.
Yeah, I mean, for me, if we're talking about what I think the most realistic trade would be, and it's a player that we've already been linked with, I think Toffoli out of Calgary would be really high up there for me. He's got 4.25 remaining on his contract through 2024. A goal scorer, a guy that you could immediately plug into your power play, a guy that you can plug into your top 6, and I think that would be a huge missing piece. There's a lot of names up there. I don't want to talk on all of them. If you have one that's catching your eye.
You did the work here. Behind the curtain a little bit. Mike had to go through team by team, sorting by players making under a certain amount of money. And so we didn't want to go through every single one of them, but we just highlighted 4 or 5. The one that stood out to me, and he's not a true scorer, but it's a guy that has a ring, has been a thorn in the Canes side for a number of years. I'm sure some of you would be upset about it, but to me, it's the absolute best move Carolina could make, especially considering how our counterparts within the division have loaded up on high skill players. And to me, the easiest, best ad Carolina could make, they've subtly been linked to him, Tom Wilson. I mean, Canes are soft. Canes can't play a certain way. Canes are not a playoff team. It's all regular season. That guy goes a long way to shutting it up. And, it'd be nice to roll into the playoffs with the biggest, baddest dude who can also play up in your top 6 if needed. To me, you can't have a better ad than him outside of some unforeseen available superstar that can pot you, 30 or 40 a year. Tom Wilson's the best ad for this team.
Yeah, I mean, like I said on the last pod, I hate Tom Wilson, and I will. You're
not alone.
I will only like Tom Wilson while he wears a Cane sweater,
it's that asshole friend who's your friend.
I will begrudgingly like him while he wears a Cane sweater. Yeah, I mean, everybody knows that that's the kind of player that changes the feel around your team, that protects a guy like Jarvis when fucking. Excuse my language. When Trouba,
I'm gonna have to slap the explicit on this one.
Sorry, Mom. When Trouba is coming and headhunting on people, right? Like that's not gonna be as fun when you have to answer the bell to Tom Wilson.
And another thing to remember, he's not a pure rental. They have him for another year if they're able to swing this deal. I think the issue would be Washington is selling. I don't think they view themselves as this is like a elongated thing. This is like a mini reset. Who can we keep? Who's not going to be around? So they don't want him to go in the division because they don't want to play versus him next year.
Sure.
But to me, name your price caps, within reason, especially with where the benchmark's being set right now.
Yeah,
very comfortable paying whatever it costs, even if that is a late pick in the 20s in the first round. Like, sign me up. Do it immediately. Who's the next name for you?
If we're going to stick to, like, for me, I'm probably sticking to a scoring winger at this point. and it's really like tied between two names for me at the next phase, and it's probably Pavel Buchnevich, out of St.
Better
Louis.
than I would have done.
Yeah, Buchnevich signed through 2025, and then Sam Reinhart out of Florida signed through 2024. Two guys that have a scoring touch, two guys that can instantly plug into your top six, power play capable, can kind of do it all, pass, shoot, score. So I like Toffoli, I like Reinhart, I like Buchnevich. I think all of them are available. The question will be, how willing is the team to part with them? We're seeing a St. Louis team that isn't like they're moving out players,
soft reset type team,
but
yeah.
Is he part of their future plans at his age? I look at it to Foley, and their Calgary is up in arms, shocked by how their season is going. Is that a guy that they're, hey, let's get a quick asset, let's move on, let's free up some cap space? And then Reinhart, Florida, same scenario as Calgary. Like, these are teams that could be looking to recoup some assets.
That have achieved based on expectation and how they performed last year.
Yep.
Those are kind of the teams that, it's decision time, right? And so another Calgary guy, former Canes, top 5 draft pick, Elias Lindholm, a guy that, I've been on record saying I was not a huge fan of and never saw this coming. Guys blossomed into an absolute stud and has put up great production, terrific two-way game. We saw that when he was in Carolina. I just didn't think the point production would follow, and I kind of thought it was from playing with Gaudreau. I think we've seen that's not necessarily the case. He's just a really good hockey player, and I think there's some bad blood there. I'm not sure that is something that's taken into account into a trade. I would not think so, because I think in coming back and the opportunity to chase a cup would be appealing. And obviously still has friends on the team. And if the organization that you were so upset with at one time goes out of their way to try and bring you back, I think that mends a lot of things. And so it wouldn't be a concern to me at all. These guys are professionals. They understand the work and the business. But I think he's a good ad. I don't think this is the case. I mean, it shuffles up your lineup a little bit more to bring another center, but center depth is never superfluous to me. I think you can never have too many. And he's clearly would be a second line center for this unit and allows you to kind of move KK up and down a little bit more of a hybrid role. And your depth would then be great. But yeah, I think that's on the lesser end of probability. We have heard Carolina linked with Calgary. I'd be shocked if it was Lindholm over Toffoli. Also, are they willing to pay that price? Because I think there's a significant disparity there.
Yeah, Toffoli is certainly the cheaper option as opposed to Lindholm. I mean, there's good names on the board. Two other quick ones out of Detroit being both Verana and Bertuzzi. Detroit was on the fence about selling in the first place. After the Hronek deal today, you might think maybe they're more open than they thought, especially after getting waxed by Ottawa 2 consecutive games. So there are names that are available that you could bring in, and Verana is like a little bit of a rehab process for his career, and Bertuzzi, we know the kind of player he is. He's a pest. He can score. He can kind of do it all, but he's going to get under your skin and all that. So definitely options out there. Can't say that we're limited. It's a matter of what the price is.
It's more so the price, and depending on the target, are they going to have, what's the money retained, and are they going to have to bring a third party in, which is going to drive cost up and, make things a little bit more complicated. But there's enough time between now and Friday to get things done. Well, we're kind of checking on Twitter throughout this episode to make sure we're not missing anything. But although it feels like most of the major moves have already occurred, we know Don works right up into the wire.
Yep.
Even going last year beyond the wire to bring in Max Domi, it felt like after the deadline had already concluded. One note on Detroit, a guy that we talked about a few episodes ago. Congrats to them on signing, extending their captain, Dylan Larkin, 8 years at 8.7 AAV. You guys heard us, really go to bat for him. A little salty, but didn't ever think it was going to happen. That he's not here in Carolina, but good on the wings. I think that's a good deal for both sides to get him under 9. They're still a year away, but Stevie Y is kind of doing it right there.
Yeah, I think they're going to be okay in the future. Locking him in is a sign that they're closer than they probably originally anticipated. Yeah, happy for him. Definitely a guy you would have loved to see in Carolina. Would have been an awesome 1-2 punch with Aho. I think you could have done the cap gymnastics to make it work. But at the end of the day, he's going to end his career in Detroit, and I'm sure he's probably thrilled about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic. And he's a Michigan guy.
Yep.
So I think it's now time. Let's pivot to, well, it might be a little bit more negative on my end. I don't want to speak for you. I don't know how you view where the Canes are right now. I've painted, at least my perspective, pretty rosy picture to this point. Before I dive into the Canes, if we're going to talk about negatives, really low-class move. I know it probably had to happen with the cap gymnastics a little bit. But how are the LA Kings going to trade Jonathan Quick? I mean, I understand they view Jonas Korpisalo as an upgrade at this stage in Quick's career. I just think it's wrong to do that to a franchise icon who literally only has a few months left on his deal with you. Let's get the bad vibes going with that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the locker room didn't react well to the news either. He won the game for him, and then he got traded, and a guy like Kopitar that's played with that's played with Quick for a long time with the Kings was not thrilled about it, and the overall sentiment in the locker room was not thrilled about it. He's been a cornerstone for that franchise for a long time, and you don't like to see things end that way. It's a team that isn't contending for a cup, so I kind of don't see the point of doing it that way.
I mean, the West is open, but they're not going to be the team.
If they were acquiring a guy like Chikrin that they saw as a long-term part of their team, I would maybe get it, but I don't know. I don't really.
Corpy's not the guy. I mean,
I don't think so. And Gavrikov is a rental unless they plan on re-signing him. So yeah, I mean, not ideal. That's not how we like to see it go down.
We talked about being a business and how it can be pretty black and white, but some players do enough for an organization to supersede that. And to me, that's Jonathan Quick. So I'm going to go off on a little, I don't even think we call it a rant, but I've been kind of alluding to a little bit of negativity here. And based on what Carolina's done to this point, and hey, this is all subject to change, comparatively to where they are right now with Boston, New Jersey, New York, Toronto, Tampa. Hey, I do think Carolina wins the Metro. Let's tick that box. I don't think New Jersey catches them. I think it's comical that people are talking about the Rangers catching them. It's not going to happen. But, oof, man, I can't say I feel better about this team than I did 2 weeks ago. And they're still playing exceptional. I mean, they've lost 5 regular season games since the middle of they've lost 5 games in regulation since the middle of November. That's pretty damn impressive. But doesn't it just feel like more of the same? I mean, does it not? I mean, at some point, I keep coming back, you got to put the chips in the middle of the table, and they're just never going to do that. I've come to terms with it. I hope in a few hours I'm proven wrong, but it just doesn't feel it's like ever going to happen. And to me, you know what that equals? Another great regular season, a harder than it should be first round, and a second round exit, and we're all going to be looking at ourselves like the Spider-Man meme. We've been here before, and it'll effectively be 4 years in a row of exactly that. I know technically the bubble, that was a play-in versus the Rangers, and they lost to Boston in what was officially the first round, but that will be 4 consecutive years where you win a playoff round and you lose in the next round. That'll be 3 straight years where you've won your division and done that exact same thing. It's kind of disheartening, and this team feels capped. And I already alluded to the fact that, yes, there could be young players emerge within this core that with enough playoff experience, they make the jump. But it just doesn't feel like they have the horses to do it again. And it's going to be more of the same. And I'm a little, not dejected, but I don't know, man. It just feels like Canes are not going to be, really in the conversation once June gets here. It feels like another late May exit, and unless something unforeseen happens, unless Igor Shesterkin is, he hadn't been terrific this year. If he becomes the guy, it's probably the Rangers in the East, unless, Boston, I don't know. But it just feels like if you had to rank them in roster and current performance right now, Canes 5, 6 in the East. I mean, I think you have a pretty valid argument. Boston, who's clearly, they're ahead of them. Carolina's been competitive with them, but in a 7-game series, probably Boston. I feel better about the Rangers. Now, can they defend? But can Carolina score on Shesterkin? It's kind of been an issue. Tampa, Carolina's never done well versus in the postseason. Toronto, not going to matter. They never get past the first round. But I'd even probably feel better about where Toronto's at from a high-end status. I mean, they've really made some moves to strengthen that team. So I'd have them at 5th. Hey, maybe I'll be wrong and the Devils will beat the Rangers in the first round. But I still feel like the Devils are a year away. So I think Canes have gone in this past month from the clear number 2 team in the East to the 5th. That doesn't scream cup winner to me. I think my season expectation was you have to get to the Eastern Conference final, or everything else is you didn't meet the mark that year. Okay, I think I'm done.
Well,
I felt good.
We're running out of time here, so I'll make my points kind of quickly. And I totally hear where you're coming from, and I think you have a lot of valid points. My mentality on it is if you go in all in this year, what's your likelihood of winning? Probably very similar to what your current likelihood is.
Sure. One thing I will say, like in the O'Reilly trade, I was listening to Dmitry Filipovich. The O'Reilly trade bumped Toronto's chances of winning the cup from 8.5 to 8.8. It's pretty nominal. So I do think we over exaggerate the trade deadline. So
I mean, it's going all in when Boston is having a historic season, when they have the guys that they have, when they add Orlov, when they add Hathaway. I mean, they have 2 elite goalies both going right now. That's a tough team to beat, even if you go out and make some insane additions. Toronto has gone all in Dubas's final year.
Gonna save that job.
You add O'Reilly, you add Achari, you add McCabe, you add Lafferty. You're eventually going to be paying Austin Matthews $15 million a year, which is what he's asking for on his next contract. All these teams are going to have a much harder time competing in the future. Boston is on the older side. Toronto is going to have cap problems. New York Rangers have a lot of their younger guys that are going to come around for new contracts. What are you going to do with Panarin? What are you going to do with Kane? What are you going to do with Tarasenko? The Islanders aren't competitive. New Jersey is trying to copy-paste what Carolina does. Right? I look at all these teams. Tampa Bay is older, still competitive. Washington's trying to retool on the fly. The most stable team out of all of them, who has the most capital to do something in the future, is Carolina. And for me, when the Canes went all in 05-06, that team was primed for a cup. You knew when you were watching that team that it was a special team. And I think we have a really good team right now, but I don't go all in on a really good team. Now, maybe next year, if negotiations don't go well with Aho and you're thinking, oh shit, this narrative might change, then maybe you go all in next year and make some of those big deadline, or what the Canes would probably likely do is earlier in the season, then you make those moves. But I think what they're doing is they're always giving their team an opportunity to win, because anybody can win. I mean, 8 seeds have won, like
the Blues in 2019.
The Kings when they were in 8, et cetera, et cetera. You put your team in a position, they're going to have a ton of chemistry. They're going to have a ton of heart. They're going to have a ton of experience. They're going to be prepared. That's what we know about this team. You don't want to reach at straws too much. We're not a New York Rangers team that all these American guys and all these international players grew up knowing the Rangers. Nobody grew up 20 years ago knowing who the Hurricanes were.
Exactly.
We're not that team. We're not going to get people who are using their no trade clause to pick where they go, and it's not going to be to the Hurricanes very frequently. Like, that's going to just not be a big
Brent
thing.
Burns, but How many before that?
Yeah, and he could have gone to multiple different places. And at the end of the day, the way I look at it is this team is good enough to win a cup. Like every other cup winner, you're going to need people to have out of their mind postseasons. It's just how it goes. That's how every team that wins a cup either has a goalie that goes out of his mind, a guy that decides to be a 20-goal scorer in the playoffs, or a combination of those things. And they have all of those pieces. You have Anderson, that's a guy that at a snap could turn it on. You have a Svetch that could all of a sudden be a 15, 16, 17 goal guy in the postseason. Aho hasn't tapped his full potential. I think Jarvis provides way more offense than he's currently giving, but he's young and he's developing. Turbo's underperforming this year. I think KK is growing. I think Natchez is scratching the surface of his potential. You have the hardest third line in the NHL to play against, and you have hungry veterans and young guys that want to win and as your fourth line and next in line. I mean, it's hard to argue with the idea of, do we need adding a Meyer would have been great. A power forward who can score, who you can lock up for long term, great. Would be awesome. But those players aren't easy to acquire, and the Canes tried to acquire him and put in a pretty great offer.
Sounds like they might have had a better offer. But.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you can't make the other team trade with you. They're going to pick what deal they think is the best. So if this team adds a goal scorer, I think they could win every series. I think they could lose in the first round. You never know. But that's the playoffs.
You've kind of recentered me on the correct perspective a little bit. I don't want to get too out in front and go, hey, 5 years from now, there's no team I would trust more to still be competitive than Carolina. That I think just the way the organization functions, that's true. But that's too much uncertainty that far in the future. I digress. You've recentered me. I agree with everything that you said. Would we like to see something else? Of course. But when you really look at kind of the math behind it, Carolina's chance of winning the cup in the past 2 weeks probably gone from 10.7% to 10.1%. It's nothing. And so just because I'm projecting past performances on this current team because it feels like the status quo, I need to remember, and I'm sure I'm not the only one here, the sky isn't falling. I'm being a prisoner of the moment, and the fact that this is still a really good team that is going to be probably one seed in the playoffs because for winning the Metro, and it's going to be a fun ride to follow. And the depth, I think, is really the key piece here. Any final thoughts?
No, I mean, I think it was a good exercise. And we still have time.
Exercise my demons.
Yeah, and we still have time to see what happens by the trade deadline. And next week we'll be able to chat. We didn't get to talk Stadium Series and other things. We can catch up on that after the trade deadline.
Absolutely.
There was just too much to talk about.
Too much going
today.
on. Mikey, enjoy Arizona, buddy.
I will. Mullet Arena incoming.